I will introduce Dr. Rachel Matthews, and then she'll be talking to us. Rachel is a minister here in the Presbytery of Southeastern Illinois, and she serves at First Presbyterian Church in Champaign as their mission coordinator and a parish associate for pastoral care. She is a champion of the many ways the PCUSA is actively partnering, educating, healing, serving, and spreading Christ's love all over the world and right here in Champaign-Urbana. She's also a licensed clinical professional counselor, and she has served as a pastoral counselor and spiritually integrated psychotherapist since 2001. She has been a state licensed counselor since 2008 in South Carolina and now here in Illinois. As a mental health professional and a spiritually integrated psychotherapist, she helps people utilize their personal spiritual resources in counseling. She helps people who seek self-understanding or are experiencing depression, anxiety, grief, or a life transition. She is informed by mindfulness, cognitive, behavioral, solution-focused, child-centered play, family systems, and psychodynamic theories, and more recently, becoming trauma-informed. She has experience working in a private practice located in a church setting and in a hospital setting as a play therapist. Currently, she sees clients at a church location in a confidential setting. Her goal in therapy is to develop adequate trust in the clinical relationship to allow you to tell your story so that you may heal and grow into wholeness. The sacred space may involve individuals, couples, or families. Sometimes spirituality is discussed openly in a session, and sometimes people never acknowledge a spiritual component in their therapy. She treats all expressions of faith with respect. She loves to garden, walk, and talk with her 3 grown sons on the phone. She loves to watch movies with her husband, Matt, and she loves sunshine and small things. So thank you very much, Dr. Rachel Matthews, for being with us today, and go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be able to do this. It's a little overwhelming doing something in a new setting, and especially over this Zoom setting, because I'm not practiced in doing Zoom classes. So I will invite your patience. So let's pray. Let's start with a prayer. Gracious God, have compassion on us this morning as we gather to talk about the mysteries of pain that undo us and those we love. Draw us close and wrap your comforting arms around us. Do not let us stray from your mercy, but free us from the embodied struggles of wrongs that disable us, and bind us to a past that stays present. We pray for forgiveness and redemption as your Son taught us to do. Amen. So now I think I can share my screen. Is that right?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay. All right. So when I start talking about trauma, I want us to be able to, that sometimes triggers people. So just talking about it, if you've had trauma in your past, just the very nature of it can make people anxious to think about it. So I want to start by inviting us to a mindfulness practice. Many of us have heard the term mindfulness used with trauma in the news and various things. There's a very simple mindfulness practice that I want to teach you, and you may have already experienced. Let's see. I want to do this. All right, so you're seeing my slides now. There we go. So this mindfulness practice has to do with grounding ourselves in our senses. When we do that, it keeps us present in the moment and keeps our brain activated in the present moment. And we'll see in a little bit how that is. So if if you would just put your feet on the ground and relax, and wherever you are, and take a deep breath and just let it out. And I want you to identify 5 things that you can see. You can do that either I can see a light switch, a calendar, a wall, a phone, and a bulletin. Just 5 things if you can say it out loud, that even helps to stay present. And now think of 5 things that you can touch and actually touch them. Your pants, your table leg, your computer screen. Ground yourself in what you can feel. And now 3 things that you can hear. Maybe my voice, the heater, maybe a car driving by. 2 things that you can taste. And I invite clients to carry mint with them or lemon drops so that they can take that out and taste it. But you can also taste whatever's in your tongue. Sometimes the air will taste as well if you're cooking bacon. And then 1 thing that you smell, and take a deep breath and let it out. So if you find yourself feeling anxious, I invite you can do that in your head. You can do that muted. If that's just way too much for you to do it at all and your mind is wandering, I invite you just to take a deep breath and let it out slowly. And notice the feel of the air on your skin as it comes out of your nose. Okay. So what is trauma? Trauma is, according to the American Psychological Association, it is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, a rape, a natural disaster. It can be a single thing, it can be multiple, long-lasting, repetitive events. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical, very normal. Long-term reactions are also normal and can include unpredictable emotions and flashbacks. It can impact our relationships and even create physical symptoms like headaches and nausea or pain, even where a trauma might have occurred. And while these feelings are normal, some people have difficulty moving on with their lives. Many people who experience a traumatic event and are emotionally overwhelmed find ways to integrate that into their lives and they move on. But others, for whatever reason, and it's not their fault, it's overwhelming and they can get stuck in it. So how an event affects an individual depends on many factors, including the characteristics of the individual, the type and characteristic of the event itself, developmental processes, how old or young the person is, or the meaning of the trauma that a person or a community puts on the trauma event, and also social and cultural factors. So we'll take a look at some of those. The pandemic has been talked about as a trauma, an emotional thing. This article with Neta Lafuente is from an ABC article that I found online. And she talks about her job and how it has been traumatic to her. She's a first responder. She's 42 years old. And it's been, she works in Houston and not in Houston. She works as a field commander in the Austin Travis County Emergency Medical Services Unit. And when she's not responding to calls, she's a volunteer team leader in the department's peer support group. So she has first-time trauma, and she also gets exposed to the trauma that her peers share in that peer support group. So she says that she's concerned about making sure that her day is as safe as possible so that she can come back the next day. And that's a very valid fear for many of our first responders. But not only that, hearing family members or other people we know who've experienced the trauma of watching somebody who can't breathe or go through the illness of COVID, or not losing their job, all kinds of things are wrapped around the pandemic as trauma. So caring for yourself and caring for others is paramount. So even before the pandemic, there was war and sexual violence, both of which people who were in the healing profession noticed that it changed people's personalities as well as their health forever. Some people's health and personalities forever. People who experienced an overwhelming emotional event had a fearfulness about them, and anxiety, or they might become sickly. People had different names for this. That's seen in this slide that I have here. Modern day psychotherapists noted after World War I that these changes were specifically related to mental health. This was earlier than Freud, although Freud did do a little bit of work on this. And actually, in literature and war times from ancient times, there was indications of the effects of trauma on people, and we could see that in literature with the early Greeks and that. So, over the years, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, most recently number 5, has tried to categorize these behaviors and symptoms of people who have experienced a traumatic event, doing so assist in their treatment. So the symptoms, here, let me just name some of the names here for this before I move on to symptoms. So you might have heard these before. Shell shock is one that you might hear. Exhaustion, delirium, combat fatigue, battle fatigue, irritable heart, soldier's heart. Excuse me, somebody's trying to come to my office. Okay, sorry. I thought I was hidden. So you might, any of you all, have any of you all heard any historical names for trauma? Some of you may have heard some that I haven't heard or had on here. I shouldn't ask a question when I can't see you. Okay, none of you all have your hands raised, so we'll just move on. But you might, we'll have a time for questions after this, so you can share anything that you want to at that time. So the symptoms cover social, cognitive, emotional, physical, and developmental areas in the DSM-5. People who are traumatized seem to live in the past, while even though they're present in the present day, they can experience what happened to them in the trauma as if it were right now. Because of the way trauma impacts them, their bodies live under stress every day, which then leads to health problems such as hypertension, blood pressure issues, inflammation, anxiety, and not being present in relationships, leading to experiences of abandonment, having a short fuse, leading to violence in relationships, sleep disturbances, major depressive disorder, dissociation, and high numbers of people who abuse substances have had a trauma in their background. They keep hypervigilant. They address their anxiety through self-medication. So this is a chart. You can see the life-threatening event and how it's unique to every person. And these are the 5 areas of symptomatic issues. For it to be PTSD in the diagnostic manual, it has to have a life-threatening event that you either experience or witness. A lot of people will interchange the term PTSD and trauma. These days, it's like, oh, I have PTSD. it's really a very specific diagnosis from the DSM-5. It has to have the experienced or witnessed life-threatening event, direct or indirect, and there have to be symptoms of intrusion, avoidance, alterations in cognitions and mood, alterations in arousal and reactivity. They have a smaller window of tolerance, and tomorrow we'll talk very specifically about some of these symptoms in depth, as well as this idea of the window of tolerance. Most people have a normal window of tolerance, and they can live within this in a certain amount of balance. When you've been traumatized, the window of tolerance is this big, and then there's a lot more anxiety and a lot more depression. Symptoms, for it to be PTSD, symptoms have to last longer than a month, and they cause significant distress. Some World War II vets did not experience symptoms until they were much older, and at least that they didn't talk about. And so whatever means of coping that their bodies had gone through in order to encapsulate that trauma maybe began to show up later in life due to health conditions, maybe a stroke or a heart attack. It opened up the defenses that their body, mind had experienced. So that was kind of a new idea for me. Okay, so, but this is not the only trauma diagnosis in the DSM-5. There are other trauma-related DSM-5 mental illnesses. There's acute stress disorder, adjustment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and anxiety-related disorders. Acute stress disorder, the person must experience or witness a life-threatening event, followed by symptoms of hyper or hypoarousal. That's a high anxiety or maybe a depressive kind of lethargy. But it only happens maybe 3 days to a month. If the symptoms persist longer than a month, then it's considered PTSD. So the intervention that needs to happen during if it's diagnosed as acute stress disorder, you have a period of time that interventions can happen, and it can actually stop the traumatic experience from progressing into PTSD. So that's an important, it's important to understand when somebody's been stressed with a traumatic event so you can intervene earlier. There's also adjustment disorder, which is actually a very common diagnosis in counseling for mental health counselors, because stress and trauma are related. And if you're going through a life transition or a stressful relationship, those kind of things affect the body in a very similar way that trauma does, maybe less intense. And adjustment disorder with mixed or anxious, depressed emotions might be considered a diagnosis. There are trauma-related disorders in neglected children, and that's what the disinhibited social engagement disorder is. This would be a child that experienced a lot of stress early on in their life, maybe in an adoptive foster home situation or abusive family situation. And the disinhibited social engagement orders, there's no filter, but socially. So this child would just run up to you, go off with a stranger, not have any inhibitions in terms of social relating. Reactive attachment disorders is almost opposite than that. They're very reactive to relationships, and you see that also in children who've had a lot of chaos in their life early on in their attachments. And then there's other anxiety related disorders that might be diagnosed because somebody has had a trauma in their life. Each person that has experienced trauma has their own unique set of symptoms, and not all people have enough of the symptoms associated with trauma to add up to an actual trauma diagnosis. So you might have had a trauma, but you don't have all the symptoms that would get you diagnosed as having post-traumatic stress disorder or something, because life has overwhelming and fear-producing events in it ordinarily, and because our bodies are naturally wired to protect us, and we're all unique. When we talk about trauma, we are left with something that is not always easy to describe or treat when things do not progress as we integrate an emotional experience or get stuck in it. So trauma itself is not a pathology. What is pathological is an emotional response that doesn't integrate fully into the person's body and mind and nervous system. So these days, we're learning so much about trauma that we know many mental illness diagnoses and even developmental disorders are impacted by trauma, even in utero. So the neurochemicals that our bodies produce as a result of trauma can cross through the placenta and affect the fetus. And our bodies are so complex and wonderfully made. The good news is that we are resilient, and I will show more about this later. Okay, so I want us to look a little bit about how the brain and nervous system are involved in trauma. I'm going to show you a little YouTube video produced by Dan Siegel, who wrote the book Mindsight. And this particular screen that you're looking at right now is charts found in that book, Mindsight. He teaches a lot of in the early on in his, he's a neurologist and also a psychotherapist. He taught parents how to help parent their children and created this way of talking about the brain and emotional stress in your relationship. And in doing that, he gave us a great model to talk about the brain and how trauma affects it. But he doesn't use this particular video to talk about trauma. I'll explain a little bit more. But I just thought he did such a great job. I will let you share his teaching ability for 2 minutes. So let me just, I'm going to unshare this and share that YouTube video here.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all of that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child, and that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
So with trauma, you've got the brain stem and the limbic system right here, and you've got your emotional memories are in this part connected with the limbic system. So in trauma, you've got your brain here, and your brain, your eye right here sees maybe a predator right here, and the brain stem is then activated, and you've got all this flooding of your autonomic nervous system coming up, and it's like ready to go. It's going to fight or flight. But say the predator comes closer, and you can't fight. You're stuck somehow, or it happens too fast. You just absolutely freeze. You flip your lid and you're frozen. And then say the predator's gone, you're stuck in this spot, and your body does this incredible thing by actually coming back online, but this is still activated. So your frontal cortex is flipping quickly. It is the memories themselves can flood all of this and flip your lid. You don't even have to. You're not doing anything. And it's not your fault. You can't regulate it. So I have another slide I want to show here that I got in a workshop that I did, and it's very, very useful to see how this happens. Oh, wait, is that the wrong one? Yes, it is. Sorry. That should be it. Huh? Well, let's see. What are you looking at? Oh, you're looking at the right thing. Sorry. Yes. It's hard for me to see the green outline that happens when you share your screen. Okay, so here is an example. Your brain stem is that hand part right down there, and your eye sees that, and it registers the threat. And as the predator moves closer, there's a little piece right at the top of your brain stem that your limbic system works with. It's called the periaqueductal gray, the PAD. It's right here at the back of your brain stem, and one scientist calls it the cockroach. It's the warning signal that sets all of these things into motion: your heart, your blood vessels, all of that. And then if it's not safe, the person can enter into a freeze. It's very important for us all to remember that this is not a cognitive choice. This is not the prefrontal cortex making these decisions. This is a very old, very ancient response that keeps us alive all the time, that is activating all the chemicals and neurosystems in our bodies to protect us. And it can shut us down, which is what happens. I will credit the National Institute of Clinical Applications of Behavioral Medicine for this chart. That's a wonderful organization offering free education for trauma right now. Okay, let me go back to our other my other slides here. So here is a list of all the things that happen on the autonomic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So this represents how your spinal cord is connected to all the parts of your body and the nervous system. Trauma affects all of this. It'll affect your breathing, your neurochemicals, your genital area, your urological area, your heart rate. All of that is affected with trauma. let's see, I've kind of gotten ahead of myself here. So, and I think I've talked about how trauma can get stuck. We can't live in a state of trauma. So once we shut down, we eventually, our bodies will do wonderful things and encapsulate that traumatic memory in a way that we don't have to operate it. If it's too overwhelming, we're not going to be able to control it. It'll control us. I think that's the most important thing to learn with regard to traumatic events in that way. The person experiences the memory of the trauma as if it's in the present moment. That's why it's called a flashback. The body stays in this state of arousal all the time, and the cortisol and adrenaline levels are out of balance because of it. Let's see, what time is it? Okay. All right. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how all these parts of our nervous system affect and come out symptomatically, and what kinds of treatment are available to us. We'll talk about all of that next week. I want to remind us before we go any further on the negative sides of trauma is in that I want to really focus on the fact that we can have hope, even though we've been in a traumatic event. We can hold that hope. Scientists have done a lot of research, and there's a lot of resilient responses that we have all the time to trauma. We have increased bonding with family and community. We normally, the normal responses can be communicating with people we love, gathering around together. The church has done this for years. And I think of the communion table, and that event in the upper room was the disciples' response, a very resilient response to a traumatic tragedy of the crucifixion of Christ. So we know about resilient responses in the church. And I think that's a really important memory that we can share with other people. So redefined sense of purpose or meaning. Sometimes when people have a traumatic event, they discover a new sense of meaning and purpose in life. There can be an increased commitment of a personal mission. I saw so many folks from the Iraq War come back and want to help people in their community, and so it can just really energize people. Revised priorities. When you face death, it gives you a new awareness of how important life is. It can. And also, it can increase charitable giving and volunteerism because of that sense of purpose. So those are all resilient responses to trauma. And as we, I'm not sure that you can actually orchestrate programmatically that. You can't really tell people, okay, go and volunteer and your trauma is going to go away. That's not really what this chart shows. It's just that when we can have a sense of hope, and we know that there are things that we can do that can help, even though that traumatic response is not a cognitive decision, just orienting ourselves, just naming something re-engages that frontal cortex, and it can help propel us in the present in a new way. So that's something. So I want to close my little presentation at this point before we open up for questions with the Psalm 139. I think it's important for us to know that, especially when we're looking at the hope side of trauma. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness as is light to you. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. So I think just to share with you a few of the resources, there's a really great article that I like Dan Siegel's work. But there's a really great article that I found online from the NCBI bookshelf. It's called From Center for Substance Abuse Treatment. And it went through the impact. Chapter 3, the whole chapter is on the impact of trauma on mental health. And if that's a topic you want to look at further, that's a particularly good resource for it. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and just hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions. And if I know we're going to talk about it next week, then I'll just say we'll talk about that further next week. So.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Just to note for everyone, this is recorded, and I hope to get it edited and posted on the church's YouTube channel by tomorrow. And to join the conversation, you'll need to unmute yourself so that we can hear you.
Rachel, I have a comment about your point about World War II veterans not, at least apparently, not being affected until later in life. And I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but maybe, at least 10 years ago, I read a book called Achilles in Vietnam. And I'm sure you've probably heard of it, but it was by a psychiatrist who worked for the VA. And one of the things he was contrasting was the response of veterans from the Vietnam War and from World War II. And those in World War II, if they were wounded, they were, they went to a field hospital and then returned to their unit. So the sense of solidarity with their comrades in arms was palpable to them. On the other hand, with Vietnam vets, a lot of them, if they were wounded, plus the fact that their units were constantly getting new recruits and people were transferring out, there was less of a sense of camaraderie. And I just wonder if that might have something to do with that phenomenon you observed and talked.
I have heard that before, and it is absolutely true that the communal response to Vietnam vets was very different than the communal response to World War II vets. So the World War II folks had those little communities that they even kept up with throughout, that they could get with and talk about privately and be together as a unit. Whereas Vietnam vets, they didn't have it there and they didn't have it when they came back. There was not community. It was very individualized, and there wasn't until later, after a lot of them had already had a lot of damage. I would say I'm blanking on all those acronyms, the Veterans of Foreign Wars and VFW, and some of those communities became really important to Vietnam vets as they went and struggled and acknowledged and struggled together. But see that by then, a lot of them had already become very involved in substance abuse, and it just didn't ritually have, and community didn't have the same kind of structure and response. Yeah. Thank you for that.
If you can take two questions from the same square, I hear parents and others talking about young people today who happen to be fairly aware of the world, going through something that sounds like pre-traumatic stress disorder, with those who are acutely aware of climate change and its impact on their futures, those who read about the what seems to be an infection of violence and rather scary prognoses for the country. Is the psychiatric, the psychological community working on something like PTSD where the P is not post, but pre.
I haven't heard that before, but I have heard young people talking about climate change as if the same way that my generation talked about nuclear war. Because when I was a teenager, the nuclear threat was huge. Of course, now we all just live with it, but we thought the world was going to end. And I remember seeing movies about the world ending and, everything burned up. And that was about the same time as the Schwarzenegger movies, where everything was getting blown up. And, I think it was a reflection of that. But I think that the violence in the world and climate change, the generation that's dealing with that are the ones that went through, that were not aware when the world tower. I mean, we can look at history and see those singular of traumatic events that affected cultural, and climate change is certainly a cultural, a widespread pandemic. It's really, it's pandemic as much as COVID is. And COVID, some people say, is a climate change. It is a climate change issue. It's because of climate change that we're having this problem. So yes, I'm going to look into that. I'm going to look into the whole idea of a pre-traumatic stress. Thank you.
I think it may just be called despair, but at any rate.
Maybe that's a spiritual issue and not a psychological issue.
I do think it's like living with an anxiety that is just ever present. And I think the pandemic has been that way. I think climate change is that way for many people. And it's there kind of under the surface a lot of the time. And at times it really engages, and one feels much more panicked, I think, about it, or scared, or has trouble being hopeful. And then at other times we kind of have more hope and have more positivity and feel like there's good things happening. But I think that's a great example, Anne.
Well, I think a lot about PTSD, or have in the past, and it seems to me like there are a couple of elements in it. One is that there's a specific event that happens where someone else, a person, is severely impacted negatively. And the person being affected, the PTSD person, it feels powerless to prevent that bad event, that bad thing from happening to the other person. It can certainly happen in a physical way, war or other kinds of things. But I think it can also occur in other situations. For myself, there is a specific event that happened at work a number of years ago, where one of my colleagues was being very severely negatively impacted by kind of what seemed to be a very unfair kind of situation. Yet I felt completely powerless to do anything about it. That affected me. That very specific event, affected me for about a year. Revisiting and waking up at night, and eventually got past it. But so it can occur in many situations.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be war. It doesn't have to be a violent event. It can be a relationship, a chaos, or a situation in which you are frozen. And you will respond to that event very similarly as you would to any other trauma. So I think that is an awareness. That's why I'm becoming more trauma informed. I'm taking some classes to help myself understand these kinds of things with regard to attachment issues, relationships, life transitions, all of those things. Even if you maybe have homelessness, if maybe you didn't expect that you were going to be homeless, and suddenly you're overwhelmed because you have all these things and you're going to be out on the streets, Well, that's a life event that's maybe not a traumatic in the same sense as war or sexual violence, but it's certainly an overwhelming, emotionally overwhelming event. Workplace trauma is common. And then you've got what other people talk about with that, disenfranchised grief, because you can't talk about your emotional experience, maybe because you've been required by your work not to talk about it with other people. And so then what happens? You just sort of keep it, and then you suddenly discover you've got gastric issues, or sleeplessness issues, or a lot of other things. So,
Rachel, what you just said brings up a colleague of mine. When we were still in Wisconsin, he was a Lutheran pastor suffering the travails of church conflict, and he began to have problems with one of his legs. His hip just ached all the time, and the doctor couldn't figure out anything that was going wrong with it, but he concluded after the conflict died down that because he was internalizing everything, that was his physiological response. Yeah, it shows up in your body.
In your body. Yeah, that's a new thing. So in the beginning of the research with trauma, everybody thought it was all in your head.
Mm-hmm.
But now they're becoming much more aware of how your whole body is affected by a traumatic event or an emotional, overwhelming situation. And those are called somatic events, where you can experience pain. I heard this one therapist in a seminar that I was experiencing or going through, talk about a gentleman who had back issues, and for a long time. And it wasn't until they worked on that the back problem and had talk therapy. It's called sensory motor issues, but they talked through the back pain and realized it was connected with with a traumatic experience that he had. So I think that whatever trauma experience he had pulled his back that way. And so when the therapist had him work through that back movement and talk about what his memories and experiences were, that's when they connected it with the trauma. And from that point on, then the memory was released and he could integrate it and then move toward healing, and the back pain disappeared. So.
One of the areas that I've read that a few churches in the United States have been very helpful with, and that is with veterans, recognizing that some of the trauma is not exclusively emotional or physical, but that it is moral trauma. Mm-hmm. And that there have been a couple of churches that have worked with veterans who are suffering from post-moral trauma disorder. And I don't think it's as simple as, a service of absolution or anything, but it's whatever it is. I don't know if you've heard about those churches. They've apparently had some success.
Yes, that's called moral injury, and it is traumatic. There's some work done on combat trauma, which is a little bit different because of the context. I mean, what happens with the body is probably similar, but it can happen with folks in combat trauma, the moral injury, but it can happen anywhere. And I think when somebody has a particular strong belief system in humanity, like maybe you're a pacifist and you can't kill anybody and you're forced to do that in war, that can create a moral injury, which is traumatic then, and it just makes the traumatic event even worse. There's a lot of issues around war trauma that I have not actually done a lot of work in, but my husband has, as he was, his father was a POW in World War II. But that whole idea of moral injury is a real field, and I can imagine that there would be things in an everyday life where you might be, especially in the work, if you were working in a corporate situation and were asked to do something that you felt was wrong, but you would lose your job if you didn't do it. You might experience moral injury in that situation. And then you would treat it just like a trauma.
Well, I think if there's no more questions right now, we've about used up our time. So Rachel, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to hearing from you again next week.
Yeah, I look forward to going in a little bit more depth next week.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.